Hello and welcome back to the IPA's Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. We've got a great panel here today and a packed program. We're going to talk about the nation state, strongly backed by Scott Morrison in a recent speech, and in an IPA report we'll tell you about today in a sneak peek. We'll also review 75 years of the Federal Liberal Party and the celebrations of that milestone. And finally, we'll look at the NBA's attempt to grovel its way out of a clash of values with China. For that segment, stay tuned because it involves American basketball. We'll be joined by a very special guest who actually knows what the hell he's talking about. In our Books and Culture segment, a very famous Books and Culture segment, we have Douglas Murray's new book, The Madness of Crowds, the classic movie All the President's Men, classic series Breaking Bad, and inevitably the Joker, the new movie with Joaquin Phoenix. I'm Scott Hargreaves, editor of the IPA Review, joined today by my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
Also in the studio with us are IPA Research Fellows Dr. Zach Gorman.
Howdy.
And Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers, Scott.
Don't forget, this podcast is brought to you by the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au to join or donate. And if you're listening to this or watching it in an app, please review it, and 5 stars would be a really good thing for the future of this podcast. But first up, as I mentioned, we are going to talk about, of course, everyone knows it's 451 years since the modern order was born at the Peace of Westphalia, and the nation states had its ups and downs, Chris, but it's having an up moment at the moment.
It's having an up moment, so thank you. That's a hell of a hook for this discussion.
Yes,
the hook that we had planned on, though, Scott, to talk about was the Prime Minister Scott Morrison gave a speech to the Lowy Institute on precisely that, on the nation state, last week, criticising what he described as negative globalism. That's the quote. Australia, he said, cannot leave it to others to set the standards that will shape our global economy. He's announced an audit of global institutions and rule-making processes that affect Australia. He has contrasted what he says as positive and practical globalism, which is responsible and participative international agency in addressing global issues, against negative globalism that coercively seeks to impose a mandate from an often ill-defined borderless global community, and worse still, an unaccountable internationalist bureaucracy. This has been described by both Morrison's supporters and opponents as Trumpian or quasi-Trumpian. I thought it's worth perhaps having a little bit of a reflection about what we think about his speech before we go on to talk about some of the research that Zach and Andrew have done. Anyway, so Andrew, what is your takeout from the speech? Is this positively Trumpian, Andrew?
Well, I think that's like so much that the Liberal Party does these days. He wanted to have a foot in each camp. So there was some sort of red meat rhetoric for people more like me, and then there was, but there was also this, underlying theme of being essentially continuing to be a good global citizen, whatever that means, and that this wasn't some sort of full-blown retreat from globalism in the sense of participating in global institutions and things. It was more a reassertion of the idea that Australia will do so when it's in our interests. So to that extent, I thought that there was, it's don't get me wrong, it's very welcome to hear an Australian Prime Minister at least flagging this, that, that for so long Australia has portrayed itself as some sort of responsible middle power, and that means that, being all in on the so-called rules-based international order is like a default position in Australian politics. So I think for that's why it attracted so much interest, is that it's really interesting to hear an Australian Prime Minister say something even vaguely different. But when I was looking at the speech, I thought it still had this kind of dual constituency problem that the Liberal Party tends to have.
Zach, do you buy this good-bad globalism? There's a positive and practical globalism, and there's a negative globalism.
Obviously, it's necessary to cooperate with other states, to have these avenues of diplomacy and all the rest of it. But I am very sceptical on too much international cooperation, particularly a UN that gives equal representation to dictatorships, gives equal representation to nation states outside of the Security Council, gives equal representation to nation states regardless of their sort of size and influence and these sorts of things. So it's not a democratic thing at all. I think it's interesting, this comparison to Trump is only being made because it is 2019. I mean, the speech itself had a paraphrasing of John Howard's "We Will Decide Who Comes to This Country." There was a James Curran article about the sort of long tradition going back to Menzies of being a bit skeptical about the international community trampling on sovereignty. So this is nothing new. It's just that it had to be reiterated because, we've been having Turnbull and these people who aren't as interested in the liberal tradition.
Is that then, so is that what we're discussing right now? So is the word globalism just describing a traditional right of centre or conservative antipathy or distaste of international bureaucracies that are filled with unfree countries? So ever since Australian conservatism has been sort of a guiding force, it's been hostile or concerned about these international bureaucracies, international regulation, the takeover of international human rights law by the left and all that sort of thing. Is the word globalism as it's being used now just the new way we say that? Or is there something new happening here? Or are we asking them to be against something else?
I think it's worth distinguishing, I guess, between the use of the word globalism and the use of the word globalisation. So globalisation is a process of the intensification of international relations and interpersonal relations created by technologies of communication and transport and things like this. So there's globalisation, which is a process of integration of the global economy. Globalism is an ism, right? It's properly understood, it's a position that it is good to strengthen, to further create governance institutions at an international level. And I think that is the controversial part about it. And the question is, can you have one without the other? So as you have this intensification of trade relations and technological transfer and things like this, does that necessitate global governance to an extent that we haven't had before? And so Morrison is putting down a marker and saying, Australia will continue to have trading relationships. Australia will continue to participate in global forums, because we never use the Latin plurals. Sorry about that. It's
because we speak English.
Yes, exactly. No, forum. No, it's true. I actually corrected myself. Forums. So we'll continue to do that. But what he's saying is we're going to step back from this ideological position that the fate of humanity is global governance.
Yeah, sorry, Chris, because when you talk about the traditions of the centre-right, it's not that it's been opposed to international institutions per se. I mean, particularly coming off the back of World War II. World War I, we had the League of Nations, which Australia was a member of. A great series of novels by Frank Morehouse about how we participated in that. World War II, we were there at the birth of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods global financial order. We're very much part of that. But what happened over time was that grab for power by those institutions, and the further ceding of our sovereignty, the exploitation by the Hawke government and the High Court of the external affairs power. So it's not an issue with the creation of international institutions through treaties duly considered and signed off on by national governments. It's just the continuing aggrandisement of those international institutions and the usurping of the sovereign authority of the nation state that the centre-right is concerned with.
What I take Andrew's point that there may be a relationship between globalism as an ideology and globalisation as an economic process. But let me give you an alternative interpretation of what's happened. And this is looking at exactly how these global institutions have formed. So very often, the reason that we have all these international organisations that Scott Morrison is rightly concerned about is because we regulate our own economies. and we regulate our own economies, and then we want to plug those economies into the rest of the world. So we want to trade while regulating at the same time. And the reason I come to this is because, in fact, my PhD thesis, which was on the prudential regulation of banking, we ended up globalizing our regulatory framework in the Basel Capital Accords. This happened in the early 1990s and continues to this day. But the reason we did that is because we had increasingly globally interested banks that were, and at the same time, we were trying to impose extremely high regulatory barriers on them. So we joined in the rest of the planet trying to regulate banks at a global level. And so much of what we're talking about, particularly in things like free trade agreements, particularly in things like environmental accords, is because we've decided that we want to have heavily regulated domestic economies and globalization at the same time. And that's really hard to do without heavily regulated international frameworks. I think that's bad.
But it can't be otherwise.
We should deregulate.
But it can't be otherwise, because we want to retain our ability to regulate. We want to retain our ability. Well, if we are to have a nation state, then we want to have the ability to govern ourselves. And then and if other countries feel the same way, then that necessitates international relations that are predicated on the idea that at best we can harmonise what we do internally with what other countries do internally, and that is something that's worthwhile. The idea that we should all substitute our internal preferences for whatever works best or most efficiently at a global level is in fact the problem. And then what we get is from working it out with other countries bilaterally or multilaterally, we end up with a kind of equilibrium that we can live with, right? It's not perfectly free trade. It's a kind of, this is why these trade agreements are so complex. We arrive at kind of a second best thing. Then, as with all of our institutions, we start throwing up a narrative about the institutions themselves and how they're self-justifying and that they weren't actually the product of a kind of conflict of values, but themselves intrinsically valuable. And we put up a story about this, and then suddenly our sovereignty is gone because we're wedded to this kind of ideological fable that we've spun that was really just an ex post facto rationalisation for a second best equilibrium.
No, and as you well know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights the UN wrote in 1948 came out of magic. Basically, it's just it came down from the heavens. But no, you're absolutely right. But what I think is underappreciated and is going to be underappreciated by someone like Scott Morrison or really any policymaker is that it is so much of these global regulatory things don't come from just an ideology somewhere else. So much of it comes from the same ideology and the same political dynamics that have given us our incredibly heavily regulated
the ideology
domestic
of the Chinese Communist Party.
We will get to that. But let's move on to something slightly closer to home with this nationhood rather than globalism. The Senate is actually running an inquiry into nationhood, national identity and democracy at the moment, which is covering things like the rights and obligations of citizenship, social cohesion in the nation state, the role of globalisation, and the extent to which nation states balance domestic imperatives and sovereignty and international obligations. I guess we can take Scott Morrison's speech as his submission to that inquiry. But you, as in Andrew, Zach, and of course the IPA's Dan Wild, also wrote a submission to this inquiry. Who wants to explain what on earth you said?
I've got it in front of me, so I can...
Go ahead. Just read it.
No.
It's going to be a very long podcast.
Strap yourselves in, because this thing's about 50 pages. No, this is a research report that we have submitted to the inquiry to help them with their inquiry.
That is kind of
because that's what we're here for. We're helpful. The report is called Australian Values and the Enduring Importance of the Nation States. That gives you a little bit of an idea of what we've tried to do here. The Senate's inquiry had extremely broad terms of reference. You could have really written anything. I don't envy the staffers who are putting together the final report. I had a look at some of the submissions that went up yesterday. They cover a wide range of topics. Anyway, ours is, as I said, we talk in this about what the nation state is valuable for, why it's valuable. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to put Australian values and some of the things that the IPA always talks about, our freedoms, our fundamental freedoms as Australians, some of the values that underpin those within the historical context of the Australian nation state. And so we talk about nationalism, which is one of the things that they asked about. And so there's this old distinction, between patriotism and nationalism. Now, it's a little bit superficial. One of the things that people don't really know about patriotism, why we didn't really use the word very much in this, is so patriotism comes from the word patria, which is the land of our fathers. And the important thing about that is the historical dimension. And this is really what, because Zach is our professional historian, we've tried to put a bit of a historical framework around this and talk about how our liberties in Australia are real things. They actually exist. They're not theoretical constructs. And they're worthwhile.
I mean, they could exist, is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, they could, and that the national identity is important in the way that it helps us create Australia as a home where we all live, that has meaning for all of us, and provides a network of meanings within which we choose and act as autonomous individuals.
Well, I found this a bit of an awkward thing to be doing, justifying Australia as a nation state, because I am a secessionist by persuasion. So I sort of had to build it up to be something.
Is there a New South Wales secessionist movement?
Yeah, it's me, pretty much.
I thought everybody's leaving New South Wales.
A close reading of this document reveals that it's a sort of New South Wales imperialism.
So you got to is it Russell Kirk that says you got to read between the lines?
Strauss. Esoteric
reading is actually really anti-nation state. But sorry,
we had in that regard, we had a pretty logical progression as far as what we describe as localism, which is also could be more toffily described as the principle of subsidiarity, the idea that political decisions should be made at the most local level possible because that is more democratic, it gives people more control, it should ultimately lead to better decision making. So we had a sort of logical progression from justifying the nation state over too much globalist bureaucracy to then justifying federalism within Australia's nation state to then sort of talking about by the end, even how we could give more powers over to local government and just really reinforce that localist idea. And another part of the narrative that I really latched onto is that historical part of it when we're talking about the fact that we're losing control, that more and more decisions are being made at the international level with very little democratic oversight. Australia was created in an extraordinary act of popular sovereignty. Not only did the Constitution have to be approved by referendums in each of the colonies, but the Constitution itself had been drafted by delegates who had been directly elected by the individual colonies. So it was this real direct democratic mandate, and the whole idea of the referendum is that you repeat that process of having a direct democratic mandate to change the Constitution, to change what the federal government is supposed to be doing, but that's ultimately been undermined. And this is the sort of start of the rot for me, is the fact that the federal government has increasingly just gone, well, we don't really want to talk to the Australian people because we won't get the answer that we want. So the sort of where it all comes together is the external affairs power and how this globalist international agreements are being used to override Australia's federal constitution in a deliberate attempt to subvert having to go through the referendum process because the referendum process is too difficult.
Do you both or either see a tension between that, so a belief in localism, a belief in the nation state, and potentially then you could have a belief in a global community as well, or is our sympathy supposed to be directed towards the nation state and local and global is sort of secondary or non-existent? Is there a tension there?
Well, one of the tensions is this idea of nationalism. So again, talking about an ism, and so the national identity is important because it, as a kind of container for the various meanings that we've overlaid on our country and the way that we relate to each other, and the sense of order that we derive from that, the predictability, reliability, that sort of thing, trust. But nationalism can be uncontroversial if nationalism means like a world of nation states. I think that's relatively uncontroversial even today. But nationalism where it's either in a progressive sense where the nation is utilised for a grand ideological project so that that trust that is built up over time is kind of exploited by the leadership for a national project of some sort. I think that starts to erase these local identities that when we're all marshalled together into some kind of active nationalism, then there's a tension there. There's another tension when nationalism comes to mean the exclusive use of the state apparatus by a particular group of people who admit no new members and in fact actively hostile to other people even when they're citizens of the country. And again, that excludes some people from the benefits of those institutions. And so again, that's another tension because those people might want to do their own things at a local level. But the harmonious arrangement of this is to make sure that at the local level, people are exercising the power over things that are meaningful to them, and that as you progress sort of up the hierarchy, and at the apex of our hierarchy is the Constitution and the Parliament, as you progress up that, the issues become broader and more general. And so there is a way of arranging it harmoniously, but a kind of activist nationalism or even a kind of activist civic republicanism, the idea that we're all engaged in some sort of meaning construction type thing where our worth as individuals is derived from our political participation.
We have to stand up in the town hall and give the speeches.
Yeah, unfortunately in Australia we don't have this kind of nonsensical American idea that creates such a tension for them. We're a constitutional monarchy, which is a much more solid arrangement. But in any event, there are tensions there, and we've tried to talk about how it's really about the harmonious distribution of powers.
Does this have any policy consequences? So obviously you've responded to the nation-state inquiry that the government's having for, I guess, reasons. But what are the practical policy consequences of this discussion?
Well, two things. So we've already discussed localism and re-establishing federalism and all the things that we've sort of been pushing through. Another aspect of this inquiry, it wasn't just about sort of nationhood in itself. A lot of it was about a disenfranchisement with the political system, movements towards minor parties, populism, all these sorts of things that the status quo isn't holding, and why that may be. So what we injected in, because we always want to put in IPA policy prescriptions and other IPA research, there's a lot of cut and paste in this research. That's how it got to 17,000 words so quickly.
No, it's all very original.
It's paraphrased.
Paraphrasing. But another real suggestion that we were driving is a stake in the community, that we need to do things to encourage people to be able to own their own home through unlocking land, through decreasing regulation, to unleash prosperity through allowing people to have jobs, reducing the minimum wage and barriers to entry, all these sorts of things. Because ultimately, having a cohesive nation and having people buy into the political system comes down to having a reason to care about the future, having a reason to care about stability, all these sorts of things.
That's excellent research there that you put together for this submission, and some of those themes were picked up, have been picked up over the years by the Liberal Party, not always, but sometimes, which is currently celebrating its 75th anniversary, or at least at the federal level. You would argue the New South Wales Liberal Party has a much older lineage. So Scott Morrison's also been busy celebrating that.
And the Australian has actually been interviewing lots of former Prime Ministers to give their views about what the Liberal Party means. But Zach, again, you're the historian, so do your history work for us.
Okay, so...
perform like a history monkey.
There was no founding date for the modern Liberal Party of Australia. It was a process. There was meetings in Canberra. There was meeting.
This is the most classic historian answer.
In Albury.
There's no
anyway, it's the 75th anniversary. Good.
The 13th is the anniversary of the process. And the UAP, the United Australia Party, that was the direct predecessor, was created basically to fight the Depression, to fight attempts at repudiating Australia's debts, and it was actually one of the most successful political parties in Australian history in its initial task. Joseph Lyons is an unsung hero. We got out of the Great Depression faster than America because we took conservative economic means. But by the time you got to World War II, that premise was dying and the whole thing was falling apart. The 1943 election is the sort of low point of the centre-right in Australian political history. It's the largest Labor victory there's ever been. The coalition was being led by the Country Party and in Arthur Fadden to that election because the UAP was so fractured that they couldn't even decide on who they wanted to lead them. So Menzies, as the mythology goes, brings all these disparate parties together and creates the modern Liberal Party to really fight the attempt in the post-war reconstruction to create a sort of socialist and interventionist state. But the nature of the Liberal Party, and I've spent a lot of my academic career trying to talk about people like Sir Joseph Carruthers and these attempts, these original Liberal parties that were founded on sort of real solid ideas, because the crux of the matter, as far as I'm concerned, is that at the federal level, every real attempt to create a Liberal Party has been based on compromise as the first premise. So you have the Fusion Liberal Party in 1910, you have the Nationalists to try to win the First World War, you have the UAP, all these sorts of things, and even trying to reconstruct the UAP into the Liberal Party is ultimately about bringing people into this sort of broad church rather than really inspiring people to believe in anything in any way.
I have a slightly different view. So what strikes me about the founding of the Liberal Party in 1944 is that it was an explicitly ideological project in a way that its immediate predecessors were not. So the UAP was this sort of cobbled together party led by a former Labor grandee. The Nationalist Party came out of the First World War and was sort of a cobbled together version of the Conservatives that had been left after the collapse of the free trade movement, the fusion with the Liberal movement and so forth. But it just strikes me that Menzies took the opportunity and said, okay, we're going to reset. We're going to try to define what it is to mean to have a Liberal Party or Conservative Party, which I think we should get to, and we'll start from there. And it is the vision of one particular man to make an ideological movement. And of course, this is the debate that we're having now. What was that ideological movement? Now, I quite like Judith Brett's description of it's a sort of moral middle class movement. Apart from anything else, it's about the inherent worth and inherent value of a majority middle class and their moral position. But now we're having this, and we've had this debate for the last 20 or so years about whether that means that it was a Conservative Party or whether it was a smaller Liberal Party, or was it a, as Malcolm Turnbull is now saying, a progressive party, an actively progressive party. How, Andrew, how would you describe that sort of ideological patrimony of the Liberal Party and how it's played out since? I think that to the extent that it is a suburban supremacist party, then this is what I thought came out quite strongly from the election, the most recent election result, was that the Liberal Party vote was strong where people were living in homes with mortgages, with their families. And so we know that the sort of the increasing concentration of our cities, the increasing impossibility of anyone, even with 2 jobs, affording a home, is going to reduce the size of the Conservative base. And we also know that when we look at the results in seats like Higgins, we know that the Liberal Party, in trying to pander to increasingly left-wing apartment renting voters, is going to jeopardise its ability to appeal to people in outer suburbs. So it has a choice to make there.
I think, we put out, Dan Wild and I, in the wake of the election, we put out a parliamentary research brief going through some of the booth results and things like that, and showing where the Liberal Party vote was strongest, and making this argument that if people can't own things, they have nothing to conserve and they won't be Conservative voters. The question the Liberal Party confronts now, as Chris said, it faced at its formation, is does it want Conservative voters? And this is the answer. If it wants to continue to be a representative of the suburbs, then probably it does. But if it doesn't want that, then its future is more Turnbull than not.
I am going to interrupt the flow of this because these are tremendous contributions. We've heard about the history of the Liberal Party, everything leading up to its formation. We've heard about the crisis it faces. It is a moment, I think, to acknowledge that for 2/3 of its existence, it's been in government federally. It has been politically, at least, a success, and you can argue to the extent to which it's hewed to those ideological foundations that Menzies set down for it, but it's never junked them. It's always paid obeisance to those ideas, and has, for the most part, enacted them. Certainly at its high points of the Menzies government, to a great extent of the Howard government, for all its flaws, it has been a remarkable achievement, and we've seen in other countries where the centre-right has not been able to achieve that kind of a record. And there was, even say the UK is a close analogue where they did stick with central planning after the war, and it took until the 1980s before they finally broke away from it. I mean, it used to be the old Labor jibe that all Menzies ever did in government was keep the socialists out. Well, if he did nothing more than that, that was probably a good thing. and I think it is fair to argue that he did do a little bit more than that. So there may well be a crisis. I feel less of a crisis than there was a few years ago.
The interesting thing about this ongoing tension between people who have a more liberal ideology and then people who arguably, suburban conservative voters, less ideological, is that the Liberal Party has been extremely successful in mediating whatever tensions there are between those people. Arguably, it has come at a cost of. In massaging these tensions, it has become a party that is mostly about winning. Now, there's nothing in particular.
But that's what a party is specifically designed for.
But like, if you're talking about it as an explicitly ideological project, then that is something different. Yeah. A couple of years ago, our boss here, John Roscombe, wrote in his column in the AFR that the Liberal Party was in danger of becoming an outright Peronist party that exists only to win elections and deliver patronage to whoever it is that supports it. Now, personally, I'm a little bit more in favour of patronage than some. I would like to see some patronage for people like me. But
waiting for the call up.
But I think that
we're going to get you on the Administrative Appeals Tribunal anytime.
I think that gets to your point, Scott. That this critique, if you like, of Menzies, that he was really only about keeping the socialists out of power, come hell or high water. Is also, that also feeds into a party that's mostly about winning and not this explicitly ideological project that Chris suggests.
There's an interpretation. I'm not sure I entirely agree with this, but it's worth discussing. There's an interpretation of what the Liberal Party is, like all parties, is a coalition of different factions and interests and ideologies and so forth. And what is the one thing that brings them together? What actually ties them together as what is its founding ideology? It's not conservatism or liberalism, because that's in dispute. It's not free trade. It's not it's not all the policies that we often discuss. What it really is opposition to the union movement. And the one thing that brings the Liberal, in this interpretation, the one thing that brings the Liberal Party together is being against the union movement having control of Australia's industrial relation laws, and through that, of course, Labor Party power. But that's stronger than just being opposed to the Labor Party. That has a policy program embedded in it. The Liberal Party doesn't want more IR restriction.
Well, it's also comes back to sort of this liberal idea that you should never have sectional interests represented in Parliament. You shouldn't have particularly a Labor Party that's explicitly there to do the bidding of the union movement. It's one of the great contradictions of the coalition is that the Nationals are essentially set up to be a
precisely that, yeah.
to be a sectional interest. So they're actually anti sort of liberal. Yeah, you could certainly make an argument that the defining ideology of the Liberal Party over its course has not been conservatism or liberalism per se. It's more been stabilism. There was one great quote from all people, Malcolm Fraser, and when he was fighting the election just after this dismissal, one of his things that he was promising to do was take politics off the front page. Can you imagine a sort of more mundane vision for what your party stands for? Politics not being talked about.
Funnily enough, that's also my interpretation of what Tony Abbott was trying to do. He was trying to slow down the aggressive, busy Gillard Rudd years and all that sort of thing, and we saw how that went. But
yeah. 6 months of radio silence after being elected.
I think that's a noble.
No, I agree. I support that. I don't want to have to think about politics, even though that would harm this podcast.
Well, let's take a break from domestic politics then and look at something that's been happening in the USA, and we're actually going to work a bit of magic here in the IPA studio. On the count of 3, 4 will become 5. 1, 2, 3. Wow! As I say, 4 has become 5. Chris, why is James Bolt sitting next to me?
Again, another really impressive segue, Scott. So the American National Basketball Association is in a stoush with the Chinese government on the one side, and Chinese many Chinese supporters, and its American supporters and fans on the other. So I thought in this context we'd bring on the director of the IPA's NBA research program, James Bolt, and of course the Young IPA podcast host, to describe what has actually happened and perhaps join us, mainly because it got really complicated as I was trying to figure out what had happened. So, James, what's going on with the NBA?
Yeah, so first off, thanks for having me on the show. You have no idea how awesome it is to bring my two worlds together of politics and NBA. So thank you to corporate America. So basically what happened was the general manager of the Houston Rockets, basically the guy in charge of making all the big time decisions with the Houston Rockets, tweeted out last week an image captioned "Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong." And this went down really badly in China. As you can imagine, the Chinese broadcaster CCTV and the digital platform Tencent said on Tuesday they've suspended planned broadcast of the NBA preseason games over the tweet. So the NBA, we don't have evidence of this, but very quickly, Daryl Morey, the Houston Rockets general manager, apologized for the tweet. The Houston Rockets owner, the guy that owns the team, he has distanced himself from the tweet itself. And the commissioner of the NBA, Adam Silver, has also removed themselves from the tweet. And the reason it's kicked off so much is because of the NBA's relationship with China, and more specifically the Houston Rockets, the team that Daryl Morey is the general manager of, their relationship with China. The NBA and China relationship is worth about $4 billion as of 2018, and it's going to keep going as the NBA gets into digital gaming platforms and stuff like that, so it's only going to expand. And Houston Rockets are very much the forefront team of the NBA-China relationship. Houston Rockets had the player Yao Ming for 9 years. If you guys know who he is, if you don't know who he is.
Very tall.
7'6".
That's your sum
total of knowledge.
The best player China's ever.
He was going to say that no matter what.
He happens to be very tall, an NBA player, who could imagine? But so he was the Houston Rockets' best player for 9 years. He was the best player China's ever produced. And yeah, it's just the marquee team of the NBA-China relationships. And the marquee sport in China right now is basketball. So the US has to distance themselves.
So how do you think about this? So this is obviously a massive tension. I think it speaks to earlier before we were talking about some of the tensions in globalisation and so forth. But how do you think about this obvious, almost humanitarian problem that to criticise a totalitarian government doing something terrible to a free city is somehow outside the pale of corporate America?
Yeah, and it's honestly one of the most shameful periods in NBA history. It's absolutely disgusting because the thing is the NBA, especially under Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, the NBA's become the progressive league. They get involved in social issues. They talk about it openly. I mean, this is the same commissioner that moved the All-Star game from Charlotte 2 years ago because the state of Charlotte passed laws about transsexuals having to use their birth their gender at birth bathrooms. The NBA moved the All-Star game out of the city. But if you stand up for democracy in Hong Kong on one tweet, that's the end of your career, basically.
So, Andrew, are there two woke capitalisms? One which is concerned about social justice in the United States and one which needs to protect the Chinese Communist Party?
On my little one-page notes here that I do when I come on the show, I just have a question. Is there a tension between woke capitalism and kowtowing to the CCP? And the answer I've written next to it is not really. So,
well, that's been a great show. Thanks for listening.
I set it up, we knocked it down.
I came extremely prepared for this. But no, the point is that arguably there's a deeper ideological consistency here, which is that, and I hesitate to use the word Gnosticism, Scott, but let's just call it...
Ding, yep.
Let's just call it materialist utopianism. And that anyway, what we've seen in some of the recent commentary about the Chinese Communist Party, in particular during the week that it celebrated its 70th anniversary in power in China, was a reluctance in some quarters to attribute the Chinese Communist Party's abuses to its communism. Now, one way of thinking about this is that there's a certain segment of the progressive left that does not want to criticise the Chinese Communist Party on ideological grounds, because that would be to indict, in fact, in some way, even indirectly, their own ideology. And so, is there a tension? Well, perhaps not. As long as everything skews left, then it's perfectly consistent.
That's a fun argument. But
it's a true argument as well. It's true and fun.
But it just doesn't hold. So think about the instances of woke capitalism that we see in the West at the moment, which is around issues like transgender issues, around issues about gay marriage, around issues about race and so forth. And on those issues, the Chinese Communist Party is uniformly not on the social justice side of that ledger. So now I think this is a shameful episode. And I think it's a shameful episode because not that I don't think the players should be able to sign contracts that say this, but I cannot imagine living with myself if I was managing the NBA and be enforcing the Chinese Communist Party's perspective on Hong Kong.
And yet they manage to do it.
I mean, I guess they sleep in their buckets of money. But it just doesn't strike me as precisely the same story. Yeah. Zach, what's your take?
There's the hypocrisy of it is the thing that's...
no, it's not hypocrisy. It's consistent.
The deep-seated that you're willing to stand up whenever it costs you nothing. This is the whole thing about having a go at all these internal issues in America that the NBA is not necessarily the most conservatively watched sport. That's why the NFL has had so many more issues with Colin Kaepernick and the whole kneeling saga and these sorts of things, because the NFL is really popular in the South, it's really popular in red states. The NBA is an urban game. It's basically designed to have players that are able to play it in the inner cities. So it tends to thrive in the places that are going to vote Democrat anyway. But yeah, that hypocrisy, and it's spreading. It's not confined to the NBA. Just this morning, news broke of Blizzard, the games company, docking a professional gamer of $10,000 of prize money that he had earned and banning him from the entire competition because he wore a gas mask in solidarity with the Hong Kong protesters.
James, I was amazed just reading up on this, how deep that relationship is with China and how involved the NBA is. So you mentioned the $4 billion at stake here, but the NBA also, it's not just broadcasting into China. I found the NBA has a training camp for basketball training in the northeastern region of China, Xinjiang, where there is the ongoing persecution of the Muslim minority there. I mean, they are deeply into this. Is it now more of a Chinese game than an American game? And
well, that's the thing. Like, the other stat is 800 million people in China watched NBA programming either on TV or digital media or their smartphones last year. That's, 2.5 times the entire population of the US. Like, China is the big untapped market for sport. China doesn't really traditionally have a big sport. They don't really have a history of it. You see soccer investing, you see NBA investing, and whoever gets the
AFL investing.
AFL investing for some reason. Whoever wins it, it stands to make billions and billions of dollars.
But this suggests, right, that the NBA is in a position to come down on the other side of this argument if it wants. It could win. If there's 800 million people in China who like watching basketball, then the NBA saying...
Could have the pro-Hong Kong game.
Could have a pro-Hong Kong game and dare the Chinese Communist Party to take NBA away from 800 million people. It won't do it. Now, why won't it do it? Well, because the thing about the Uyghurs, for example, is that they're being persecuted because they are religious, right? And what do we see? What do we see in our society from progressives? We see rampant irreligiosity, hatred of religious people. So... the consistency here is that the overall project of designing a new progressive man, right? And so they don't care how it's done. It's completely instrumental.
I don't know. I think you're looking for conspiracy when cowardice is going to do.
It's not a conspiracy. It's just a deep value alignment.
But like the Houston Rockets owner is a Republican. Like this is just a bunch of people who are looking at each other going like,
and the Brooklyn Nets owner
is like they're owned by someone who's got like an investing stake in Alibaba. And it's very quickly the NBA's pivoted to be like talking to the China as like, your team is now the Brooklyn Nets and you will go for these guys now. And I fully expect a great player from the Chinese Basketball League to be on the Brooklyn Nets within a few weeks just to sort of massage that relationship down.
How is this affecting the sport in the US?
Well, it's only been a few days, and the season hasn't begun yet. October 22, it's going to be the great day, but it's like
maybe,
yeah, hopefully. But a lot of athletes are remaining completely silent on this, including you're going to love this, Bushnell, but Steve Kerr is the coach of the Golden State Warriors. They've been the best team for the last 5 years or something like that. He tweets out something anti-Trump or anti-guns every 2 days, and he was asked, "Do you have any comments about the China situation?" He just straight up said, "No, I don't."
But what he said was, "Well, I'd have to do a bit more research because my opinions about Trump and guns are really well studied. I have books. I just have rooms full of books about these topics. But about
I'm
China,
a professional gun historian.
About communist tyranny, I know next to nothing." So
so it's quite clear the NBA said, "Do not talk about this at all." There was a statement from Adam
Hop
Silver
on
today.
Wikipedia, buddy.
There's a statement from Adam Silver today saying the NBA will not put itself in a position of regulating what players, employees and team owners say or will not say on these issues. We simply could not operate that way, which does seem in a bit of a discourse to what they actually did 3 days ago. But, they want this to go away as quickly as possible.
It's continuous with a broader issue in American culture, which is the influence of Chinese investment. And I think one of the things one of the interesting things about this is, are we watching the demise of American soft power? And I think countries like Australia have really ridden on the coattails of America's soft power, its ability to promote ideas that we agree with around the world in ways that are entertaining for people so that they get this message. Like the very basis of American film, right, is the idea we watch a protagonist overcome a struggle, and he does it in the end with his kind of individual gumption, right? That's the basic American story. And America's ability to promote these kinds of stories through its movies, through its music, through its sport is diminishing as the world continues its extremely naive economic collaboration with the Chinese Communist Party. You have to be careful to separate them from the Chinese people. And I think what we see here is a continuity with, say, Tom Cruise in the latest Top Gun movie having the patch on his back, having to have the Taiwan flag taken off it, and things like this. The ability of Chinese investors who are this is the important thing, they keep their money as long as they toe the Chinese Communist Party line. And the Chinese Communist Party has extreme soft power these days, and it's come to the NBA.
But I don't see I agree with you that the American soft power is in decline at that margin. But I do not see a cultural soft power coming out from Chinese investment, because we are still watching these hero movies. Now, of course, it's the Avengers, so there's like 90 heroes, but they are nonetheless heroes. And
well, they're all anti-heroes. Ask yourself now. No, seriously. Ask yourself whether Jimmy Stewart would have a career these days.
Let me finish the point though. We are not watching China cultural soft power, and we are not consuming Chinese music and Chinese movies and Chinese podcasts, but we are doing that for the United States. And my claim is that not that China doesn't have the economic capacity to do that, or even that there's a cultural desire to do it. My claim is they are terrible at it. Yeah. They are absolutely abominable at soft power.
And the Americans are not as bad as you say. I mean, there's a reason why the protesters in Hong Kong are waving the American flag, and it's not just to get on American TV. And the backlash to all of this in America on both sides of Congress and on podcasts like this one, it shows that just because the business community might be rolling over doesn't mean that these are widely shared values. Soft power, America needs to find a new way to do it to square this circle, but it's not dead yet.
I think it's a bit hollow to say that we're not, consuming Chinese movies. Well, first of all, there's a language barrier, but the more pernicious threat is the fact that the American movies are being China-fied.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they don't need to do it through
just
some
because
sort
it's
of
not in
Beijing
Mandarin.
film company. Hollywood is doing it for them.
Have you seen The Wandering Earth?
It is awful. The book is amazing.
It is
so we
terrible.
should all be consuming Chinese sci-fi novels. That's my claim. But anyway, nonetheless.
The novels have some merit. The movies are terrible.
Well, thank you very much, James.
No, please.
We much appreciate your deep insights into the NBA culture.
Yeah,
the IPA has paid you a lot of money to really dig into.
Thank you, yeah. And I look forward to, I'll monitor the league for another year or so, just to make sure any other stories come out.
He's going to put his NBA subscription on the IPA tab.
IPA research.
That's a nice little earner.
I don't think that one's going to get past the accountants.
That explains what he does all day. It's IPA research.
Not anymore.
Thank you, James. We'll be back in a moment.
Cheers.
Welcome back. Great contribution from James Bolt there. We have now reached the segment of the show where we do books and culture. Chris, what have you got?
So speaking of the hero story that Andrew has described, I watched All the President's Men, the story about the Washington Post investigation of the impeachment of Richard Nixon, or at least the investigation of the 1972 burglary of the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate apartments. Now, I expected to be watching this to learn a little bit more about the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Turns out this movie has basically nothing to do with the impeachment of Richard Nixon. It's all about how amazing journalists are. And
your favourite topic.
Which is something that, yes, I will explain, really gets me going. So you actually see journalists these days recommending to younger journalists that they watch this movie, and you can understand why, because the journalists, of course, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, spend a massive amount of time digging up this great conspiracy that goes all the way to the White House and then all the way to Richard Nixon, and they pull down a president because of their dogged work, and I have no doubt that a lot of that dogged work occurred. Now, it doesn't really occur these days anymore. There's no way that a newspaper would send a journalist out for 6 weeks to dig around library archives, but what it really triggered in my mind was many of my opinions about journalism as a profession. So there's this scene in there, one of the key scenes that really gets them going is they call up the White House librarian. So the White House has a library and they call the librarian direct and they ask her, oh, has this person took out any books on this topic? And she immediately goes, oh, yes, absolutely. No, he was here yesterday. Now, the lesson there, and then that becomes a thing and she tries to roll it back and then, oh, we never spoke and all that sort of stuff. But the lesson there is, and this is what I try to teach people, journalists have this belief in themselves that their secret power is that they can call up anyone they want in the country and demand answers. And for some reason, all of us, we, the general public, answer those questions because we think it's necessary. We think they have some sort of power to answer those questions. They don't. But the power of the journalist is that belief. That shared belief.
Is it that belief, or is it just like a deeper, like, human decency thing where someone asks you a question, you feel like, answer it honestly.
I mean, that's what it's
also
playing
their
on.
skill. It
No,
is
no,
their job.
I know.
And some of them are better at it than others.
Some of them are better at it than others, and I've noticed since I've been involved in public debate that more and more you get these questions over email, which is just idiotic because you can just delete the email and not worry about it, and or you delay and they're like, oh yeah, I need this email back. But it's the best journalists are the ones that call you and they're like, oh look, I'm about to go to print. You know, have you done this? And you go, oh my god, I have to tell you somehow. No, you don't. You don't have to tell you.
Yeah, thank you for our media training 101 course there that we give everyone at the IPA. But yeah, it's an important movie because I think it actually destroyed a generation of journalists because they were all forced to watch it. And the heroes were these investigative reporters who brought down a president. And not just in the US, but I think it came into Australia. This idea was that then was the job of the journalist. The job of the journalist was to bring down presidents. It is to bring down governments, and that if they just work hard enough, they will find a conspiracy. So this was really, I think, the end of the era when reporting had anything to do with just reporting on the news.
Yeah.
It was journalism with an agenda, and has been ever since.
But it's even without going. It's not even the agenda. It's the practice and the thought process that they come to. So they came to this conspiracy, or they came to this discovery because they matched lots of different people that had lots of different relationships. So there's a string of relationships that goes from the Watergate burglars all the way to, and then that person said something to that person, and eventually you get to Richard Nixon himself. Now that happened, but so many journalists, at least in my experience these days, are just looking for, well, you know, that person once worked with that person, so therefore there's an obvious connection, and that person was once funded by the Koch brothers or Koch Industries in the United States, so therefore if I plug it all together, over time it becomes this person is funding this person to do that person, when in fact, I mean, certainly in Australia, we're a small country and everyone knows each other. And the journalists that have this idea that we've got to uncover these relationship conspiracies actually present all those fake news and those false narratives that that really just confuse public discussion.
Are we thinking here of the story yesterday in The Guardian about...
Which one was that? Sorry, I missed that one.
Scott Morrison's nanny's husband or something.
He's a well-known
alt-right blogger.
Yeah, so there's this alt-right blogger. His wife is friends and has always been friends, apparently since they were children, with Scott Morrison's wife. And The Guardian wants to know whether this bloke has Scott Morrison's ear and is steering him in towards the direction of QAnon.
So explain QAnon.
No. Well, I don't know if we have enough time.
I don't think we have enough time.
Give a vibe of QAnon.
No. I understand. Yeah, like I say, this is what journalism has been ever since. All the President's Men, starring Robert Redford and
Dustin Hoffman.
Dustin Hoffman as Carl Bernstein. Yes, and Bob Woodward then produced
a sad figure.
A series of incredibly dull books. Incredibly dull books.
Yeah, no, a sequence of books that are just getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. So a book that is not dull is this one by the great Douglas Murray, the UK-based journalist and commentator who was, of course, interviewed by our very own James and Pete for the Young IPA podcast, I think the most watched podcast or broadcast we've ever made at the IPA, a terrific interview which I commend to you. So this book is called The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race and Identity. It's just out. I just finished it last night, so this is not a mature take. You'll have to read the next IPA review for that when Bella Debrera gives us one. But I do recommend this book. It's very thoughtful. Murray is a journalist, a chronicler, sort of a gentle thinker, so it's not like he's gone out with some screaming hypothesis about identity politics and then measured all evidence against that. But he is trying to get to what he calls the madness of the crowds, this collision of intersectionality, the obsession with race, class, gender, the idea that somehow they can all be reconciled. There's some tremendous individual stories in there. He starts, he's talks about the experience of gay politics because he himself is gay and remembers what it was like when just equality was what you sought. And he talks about Martin Luther King and what it was like when in race politics what you sought was equality. Similarly with feminism, what you sought was equality. And now we've moved on to something where it's not equality, it's a certain simultaneously you can't hold both ideas at once, but they do. It's the idea that we're all equal and can do anything, but actually we're better. Our moral claims are actually superior to anyone who is not in the minority race, who is not female and who is not gay. So it's sort of this status game. And he says they're irreconcilable, but it doesn't matter because not everything has to make sense in this crazy world we live in now. And it's just about social media, getting on crowds, destroying people's careers, people being hounded out of journalism or universities, professors being assaulted, at universities, or visiting speakers like Charles Murray. And then he sort of brings it home with what's a much more recent phenomenon, which is the rise of trans and trans politics. And as he points out, this has all happened so incredibly quickly. The world has just flipped in 5 years, and I think that's why it's good that Murray is sort of gently investigating and trying to tease out the issues, because it's like this experience of, my God, what just happened? And so this is not the end of this discussion, but I think it's the start of one. And at the end of the book, he talks about ways we can find our way back. But there's no doubt that what he shows about identity politics is that it is a disastrous turn of events. It's anti-freedom. It's got this sort of collision of Marxist and postmodernist thinking is going to lead us down some terrible byways before we find our way out again. So there's a cheery thought for you.
Yeah, no, what strikes me as you were talking is that identity politics always requires the next group of oppressed people. It always requires, so after there's the same-sex marriage debate, and same-sex marriage is largely legal in across the developed world, then you need, okay, well that's so we need to talk about trans people, and then we'll need to talk about another oppressed group. So I reckon that movement that you've seen very rapidly is probably a sign of rapid changes in the legal framework around those.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But it brings its own contradiction because, say, Germaine Greer, who's been a famous feminist for 50 or 60 years, when she said, "Yeah, trans, great, that's your choice, whatever." But I remain interested in the issues facing women who are biologically women, and that only. So she's now been shamed out of it. She's been declared no longer a feminist because she won't embrace trans politics. Peter Thiel was out and proud as a gay man living in America until he backed Trump when it was written that he's no longer gay. Kanye West was seen as a very successful member of the African American community until he came out and supported Trump, and it's now been declared that he's not actually black. You've become a white man. This is the madness of the sort of desire to always push the boundary, push harder, find new oppressions. The oppression Olympics. It's not going to end well. Zach, get me out of this hole I've just dug for myself.
Zach watched a movie.
Yeah, so I saw The Joker, and I don't know where you want to start as far as just very briefly going through all of the controversies, because you have, apparently it's going to be some sort of attraction for shooters, that there's going to be an emulation of what happened in Colorado with the Dark Knight Rises. There's accusations that it's some sort of justification for incels, these young male virgins that the media has decided to vilify because they're on Reddit and all those other things that they hate. And there's also all these negative reviews that's come out basically because a lot of the left-wing media don't like to think about the idea that a white male could possibly be oppressed anymore, that is somehow subversive and right-wing to say that a white male could be oppressed. I thought, obviously, none of that is actually part of the movie. It's an example of the left eating itself, because if anything, there's a sort of justification for left-wing terrorism that goes on throughout the movie. But I actually quite liked it. I think it was important that they did this sort of vague 70s setting where you could really buy into how bad Gotham as this pseudo-New York is and how bad the protagonist's life is, because there is that sort of context in late 70s America where, the world was pretty terrible back then.
Particularly New York feels very broken. The public transport looks broken. Everything's,
Yeah, and I've got a bit of a soft spot for any modern movie that doesn't slavishly follow the 3-act structure. I've been so sick of formulaic movies. I've been so sick of superhero movies, frankly, and I'm not sure whether I should feel happy that they're finally doing something within the superhero genre that's so different that actually feels like a real movie again, or whether I should be sad that to make a movie like this, you have to shove the Joker into it. It has to be about this supervillain. That's the only way that it's going to get made. It's an homage to Taxi Driver. It doesn't quite reach the heights of some of the movies that it's trying to play out, but it's more about the context and how refreshing it is to see a movie like this.
Yeah, no, I watched it. The only thing that annoyed me, I mean, as a movie, it's terrifically well made, and as you say, it's a character study. And what a shame that you have to make it about a psychopath to get it funded. But there was a little bit of sort of Hollywood BS in that they threw. There's a lot of ideas in there that can be interpreted a lot of different ways, and I don't think there's a take. I think this is how you have this sort of faux intellectualism in Hollywood. You just sort of throw these ideas in. There's a bit of popular uprising. There's a bit of the backstory about victimhood. All that kind of thing.
Well, what Renee noticed around all the different arguments you've had around it, one of the sort of subtler things that Renee noticed because of her background was that it's actually could be interpreted as a justification for people with mental illness not taking their medication, because there is that stuff towards the start where it seems like it's more justifying that we need to put more money into mental health. His therapist has to stop seeing him because of public spending.
Spoiler alert.
That's right at the start. But yeah,
define spoiler.
Later on, he stops taking his medication, and it seems almost to be a positive thing.
It was never going to end well. Speaking of medication, Andrew.
So
Speaking of medication, that's great. I really like that one.
Good,
not Andrew. The topic.
The obvious segue was like from one anti-hero to another,
okay.
But this was much more clever.
Josh, can we re-record that? No.
Yours was better. So I have introduced my wife to Breaking Bad. She's never seen it before. We have watched Better Call Saul, and I signed up for the free month.
Which is the prequel, so you've actually seen it in the order of the time order.
Yeah. And so signed up for the free month of Stan to burn through Breaking Bad, which is about, for anyone who missed the zeitgeist, is about a chemistry teacher who finds out he has what looks to be terminal cancer, and to make money for his family, he decides to put his chemistry skills to the purpose of cooking the most pure crystal methamphetamine the southwest of the United States has ever seen. And the story progresses as he becomes more and more involved in this business. And along for the ride is a sidekick that he kind of ropes in as a former student of his who's a low-level drug dealer and can help him get into this business. And so the reason I said that the obvious segue I thought was for one anti-hero to another is because, as we were talking about with this narrative of like watching a protagonist overcome some kind of struggle, the anti-hero has been more and more of a theme in American storytelling over the course of my adult life. Breaking Bad is part of what was called the golden age of television that started with The Sopranos, Mad Men, these shows that tended to have a male anti-hero, a guy who was flawed, but you couldn't help barracking for him anyway because he had such style. Usually it's style that gets you on board. And so what's interesting about that, for me anyway, is why fixate on the anti-hero and not a traditional hero Jimmy Stewart never would have cooked meth.
There's a long. Did you write that down?
No.
There's a long history of anti-heroes in Hollywood. Now, whether anti-heroes are now more dominant is an interesting discussion to have. Again,
but even Batman was an anti-hero. So you make a movie about Joker, but
maybe this distinction isn't that useful. Maybe they're sort of anti-heroes for good, or now we're more interested in their flaws than their heroic.
Although this conviction that movies should be morally complex is perhaps what feeds into Scott's observation that the underlying thesis of some movies is not always clear. That it's more a melange of different ideas rather than a clear thesis. Breaking Bad, you spend a lot of time waiting for his comeuppance. Because you think that eventually this should be bad for him. But what's great about Breaking Bad is that it's a character piece as well as a really of these golden era stories, it's probably the most fun one
and funniest.
Funniest.
It's a comedy.
Yeah, apart from season 2, which is incredibly dark. But watching Walt manifest this flaw that was deep in him already. So it's called Breaking Bad, but there's this question about whether Walt was already kind of a bad guy, and this was just an excuse for him to do bad things.
And he keeps doing it after he needs the money.
Whereas his drug-dealing sidekick, Jesse, is deep down a good person who has had a somewhat traumatic upbringing in various ways. Is kind of a flawed character. And watching their paths kind of intersect as their essential natures are kind of borne out. It's a very clever storytelling device, which makes Breaking Bad really compelling even when it gets very dark.
Yeah, and speaking of anti-hero, I mean, it has been part of Hollywood forever. In the 30s with the gangster films, the compromise they always used to make, with the censors, was they'd have these gangsters like Jimmy Cagney would play these gangsters who would be tremendously charismatic and successful and well dressed, as you say.
But I think you can make the argument.
But then at the end of the movie, that this was the deal with the censor. They get shot. Yeah. And as they lay dying, they lean into the camera and they say,
I think you make the argument it's more prominent these days, and part of it is this postmodern theme of deconstruction. So where does that take you? Well, if we deconstruct the hero story, we end up with an anti-hero. One of the great films, and it pains me to say this, one of the great films is almost responsible for this trend, and that's Unforgiven, the Clint Eastwood revisionist Western, and that is rare in this kind of genre, or at least for the time, was that it didn't pull its punch at the end. There was no comeuppance, there was no redemption for Clint Eastwood's character in that story. In fact, when they get to the bad guy, Gene Hackman, and he gets him on the ground and he has a gun pointed at his head, he basically just says, "Good night," and he shoots him. And
Now that is a clear spoiler, I have to say.
Well, this is a 25-year-old movie.
And Gene Hackman's final words, "I was building a house." He was about to go straight. Too late. Too late, she cried. And we have reached the end of the show. Thank you for listening and watching Looking Forward, the IPA's podcast. If you want to subscribe, please do so now on the app. If you want to learn more, go to ipa.org.au. You can read the bios of my wonderful co-hosts and guests today. We'll be back with more. I should say thank you to Chris Berg.
Yes, thank you. And I want to point out something else. One of our close colleagues and one of the IPA Looking Forward podcast guests, regular guest, Aaron Lane, got his PhD yesterday. So he's now Dr. Aaron Lane, and congratulations from the Looking Forward podcast, Aaron.
Well done, Aaron. And another doctor, Dr. Zach Gorman, thank you for being on.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers, Scott.
Big shout out to James Bolt, our special guest for today, and to Josh Stranger in the control room. It's been great. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.